Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over dungeons in Diablo 4. Now dungeons are going to play a pretty substantial role in every section of the game, so I wanted to go over the basis of these dungeons and then go over dungeons in an endgame sense. So at the launch of Diablo 4 there are going to be over 150 unique dungeons that all have an entrance out in the open world. These aren't just going to be a thing like Rift from Diablo 3 where you just open a portal and go into them. You'll actually have to go travel to their entrances and enter them, being a physical place out in the world. And most, if not all of these dungeons, you'll be able to go do while you're leveling up. So if you come across a dungeon, you can go in and do it. These just aren't endgame activities, and some dungeons you even have to complete other activities to unlock, such as clearing out a camp, and that will unlock the entrance to a specific dungeon. And also keep in mind, we don't have all of the specifics for these dungeons. Has been a little bit vague, but I've tried to put together an understandable explanation for these from all the information we have. And one of the big pieces of information they want to get across when talking about these dungeons is that they're actually a physical place that you will know what dungeon you're in when you're running through it. But with that being said, there still is random elements of these dungeons that will allow them to change the enemies in them and even connect different tile sets in these specific dungeons to where they will be heavily replayable, but also you'll still understand that this specific dungeon is this specific dungeon, and it's not going to be a randomized tile set with a randomized direction like rifts were from Diablo 3. So at a base level, going into one specific dungeon, you will always be able to tell it's that dungeon. It'll have a similar environment, but the path could be randomized, the enemies in it can be randomized, and where these enemies are placed can be different, and they can even connect to different tile sets seamlessly in these dungeons. But they also want to keep pretty much everything in these feeling like that specific dungeon. And also keep in mind, even though one specific dungeon isn't going to have as many different variations on it as, say, a Rift from Diablo 3 would, there are also over 150 dungeons. So overall, you're going to get a lot more variation in Diablo 4 as a whole compared to Diablo 3 Rifts. So that brings us to the end game version of these dungeons, because all of these 150 plus dungeons aren't just for going in when you're leveling up, but there are going to be different versions of these dungeons you can do at max level, and these are going to be called nightmare dungeons. Now, nightmare dungeons are specifically an end game version of these dungeons that are activated by getting what's essentially a dungeon key and what they are calling a nightmare sigil. And these nightmare sigils are essentially dungeon modifiers that increase the difficulty of the dungeon and applies a bunch of different affixes and powers to that specific run of that dungeon. And they haven't talked about all the different stuff that can happen to the dungeon when doing this, but most likely you're going to be getting a lot more loot. You're going to be getting different types of loot, probably higher chances for higher rarities of loot, but the dungeon going to be harder, and it's going to have different affixes applied to that dungeon, which presumably would mean that all enemies have these affixes, or the dungeon itself has them, so there could possibly be like more traps or more environmental hazards. Now, we don't know if there are going to be powers that also buff you. A lot of games that have systems similar to this will also have maybe kiss curse effects where you get a bonus effect, but there's also a negative effect, or there's effects that buff up enemies you're going against in some way, but also give you that buff. So not sure on that, but these nightmare sigils also just have a kind of power level to the dungeon, or I guess better explained as a difficulty level. And a good comparison for the system would actually be Mythic plus Dungeons from World of Warcraft, where essentially you're earning these different keys from different activities, where then you kind of slot into that specific dungeon, and it's going to augment that dungeon and make it much harder depending on the specific difficulty you get and depending on the different affixes on that specific sigil or key that you have obtained. obtained. Now, nightmare sigils aren't going to be something that are really rare to obtain. They actually want you to obtain these keys all of the time and have a bunch of different options, because specifically what they're trying to accomplish with this system is that you're not going to want to go and run every nightmare sigil you obtain. Because these nightmare sigils are going to be applied to a specific dungeon and have random affixes, random powers, random difficulty levels, they want you to actually pick and choose what sigils you actually want to go and use. So if one sigil has really bad affixes for the current build you're running, you can just skip over that one, go put that one in your stash, and then go and look to do another key. And this will also give you more player agency to choose what you want to go and do, instead of essentially just getting a rift in Diablo 3 and going into that rift and not really having a ton of options on that except just the difficulty level. And stuff like this will also allow you to do a bit higher difficulty of dungeon runs that maybe you're not particularly geared for yet if you get the perfect affixes that are in line with the build you're currently running. And also with there being multiplayer, you and your group can kind of just sift through all your sigils and find the really good sigils for your group composition, and all the different builds that your group is running. Now, we're not sure of all of the different ways that you're going to be able to obtain these nightmare sigils. We've only been told of one way, and that is called the Tree of Whispers. Now, we pretty much have no other information on the Tree of Whispers besides that it's a specific endgame system that gives you objectives to go do out in the world, and this will be one of the primary ways you go about obtaining nightmare sigils to go do nightmare dungeon runs. And also something else that they have mentioned for dungeons is that specific dungeons will also give a higher chance to get specific items. So they mentioned that, say, this specific dungeon will have a higher chance to drop helms, or this dungeon will have a higher chance to drop legs. But that's the furthest they've gone to explain some additional ways of targeting specific loot. And if I would have to wager a guess, I would expect that they continue to do this in a bunch of different ways. First off, I would fully expect that this would also continue into nightmare dungeons and on nightmare sigils. So maybe you get this nightmare sigil and maybe it has an amplifier on that nightmare dungeon run, giving you a higher chance to give rings, or maybe just this dungeon has a higher chance to give you like legendary legs or something along those lines, because there is 150 dungeons, and having these randomly rolled keys to go into the endgame version of these dungeons, I would fully expect they're going to utilize that to allow you to target farm specific gear much more than you've been able to in a lot of other Diablo games. So all of these different elements combined is going to make the dungeon system in Diablo 4 incredibly replayable, just with the sheer amount of different dungeons you have, and then those dungeons also having a bunch of different randomized elements inside of them, and then adding on, once you get into the end game, having nightmare sigils that also will apply different affixes and higher difficulties and different rewards onto those already randomized dungeons. You are going to have just a ridiculous amount of replayability. And another thing they did mention when talking about these dungeons is that a lot of this is to try and stop or minimize the burnout you would get from, say, playing something like Diablo 3 Rifts, where pretty quickly in you would kind of just be running into the exact same things, and having these kind of different layered amounts of randomized systems or different variations you have should almost give you an infinite amount of replayability, with having something being different in every single one, which I think will definitely add a lot of replayability in the end game of Diablo 4, which also seems to be something they are purposefully trying to make much more expansive than what was in Diablo 3. But that's pretty much all I want to go over for the dungeons of Diablo 4. And like I mentioned, there's still a lot of specific information we don't have on these dungeons, but I do think as a general design philosophy, I do think these dungeons are a pretty massive upgrade coming from Rifts from Diablo 3, and I think these will give a lot of very replayable content, especially once we get into the end game and start getting these nightmare sigils. So subscribe if you want to see more Diablo 4 or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about dungeons for Diablo 4, and thanks for watching.